Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
We are from Group 4. Will present about the empire and its discontent. My name is Latifah Rahmadiatullah, and my friends are Firda Fajriya Rosida, Lulu Fadlina Anifa, and Yasmin Nur Sabilillah Putri. Uh, Next, these are the questions that will be we discuss about. The first is how do you define colonialism and imperialism? The second is what is Orientalism? What is Said's argument? What does he have to say about the how Europe construct the Orient? Then, what are some of the differences between anti-colonial and decolonial ways of thinking? And the last is how does the history of colonization pertain to the UK or Indonesia today? The first question will be explained by Virda. Time is yours.
How do you define colonialism and imperialism? Next, colonialism. Colonialism is defined as a practice in which a power sets up colonies or settlements elsewhere in other countries or territories for the political and economic benefits of the colonizing country. Imperialism, imperialism is understood as a policy of a country in which that said country influences other countries or territories through military force as well as other means of power. Colonialism is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. One of the difficulties in defining colonialism is that it is hard to distinguish it from imperialism. Frequently, the two concepts are treated as synonyms, like colonialism. Imperialism also involves political and economic control over a dependent territory. The etymology of the two terms, however, provides some clues about they differ. The term colony comes from the Latin word colonus, meaning farmer. This root reminds us that the practice of colonialism usually involves the transfer of population to a new territory, where the arrivals live as permanent settlers while maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. Imperialism, on the other hand, comes from the Latin term imperium meaning to command. Thus, the term imperialism draws attention to the way that one country exercises power over another, whether through settlement, sovereignty, or indirect mechanism of the control. Next. And next will be present by Lulu Fadlina.
What is Orientalism? What is Said's argument? What does he have to say about how Europe construct the Orient? Next. Orientalism. Orientalism is the imitation or depiction of aspects of Eastern cultures in the West by writers, designers, and artists. Orientalis was more widely used in art history, referring mostly to the works of French artists in the 19th century, whose subject matter, color, and style use elements from their travel to the Mediterranean countries of North Africa and Western Asia. Next, Said puts forward several definitions of Orientalism in the introduction to Orientalism. First, a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in Europe Western experience. And the second, style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and most of the time the Occident. And the third, Western style for dominating restructuring and having authority over the Orient. And the fourth, particularly valuable as a sign of European Atlantic power over the Orient, then it is as a veridic discourse about the Orient. And the fifth, distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetics, culinary, economic, sociological, historical, and philo- philological texts. And the sixth, the classical tradition of studying a region by means of its language and writings. Thus, anyone who teaches, research, or writes about the Orient is an Orientalist. And last, a library or archive of information commonly and in some of its aspects. An anonymously held family of ideas and an unifying set of values. This idea explains the behavior of Orientals. They supply the Orientals with a mentality, genealogy, and atmosphere. Most important, they allow Europe to deal with and even to see Oriental as a phenomenon possessing regular characteristics. Next, Said's arguments. Edward Said argued that Western scholars were so contaminated by their Europe ideas and preconceptions that they could not deal honestly and fairly with Asian topics. And next, he argued that a long tradition of false and romanticized image of Asia and the Middle East in Western culture had served as an implicit justification for Europe and the US colonial and imperial ambition. And the next, Said argued that the West had dominated the East for more than 2,000 years since the composition of the Persians by Aeschylus. And thus Edward Said argued that the Europeans divided the world into two parts, the East and the West, or the Occident and the Orient, or the civilized and the uncivilized. And the next present by Arum.
Okay, the next question is what are some of the differences between anti-colonial and decolonial ways of thinking? The anti-colonial framework is a theory about the mechanics and operation of colonial and recolonial relations and the implication of imperial projects on processes of knowledge production, interrogation, and validation. And then the understanding of indigeneity and local indigeniousness. Uh, and then the pursuit of agency, resistance, and subjective politics. The anti-colonial theory works with the idea that all knowledge must purposefully serve to challenge colonial imposition. Anti-colonial framework theorizes the natures that extent of social domination, and particularly the multiplications of power and how this relation of power work to establish dominant subordinate connections. The idea of colonial of power, that is, an imperial power as exercised, is beyond the power and agency of the subordinated and extends beyond asymmetrical powers relation. And then, anti-colonial theory also recognizes the central place of spirituality and the spiritual knowing embodiment of knowledge. Next, meanwhile, decoloniality proves that coloniality still exists and it survives colonialism. Decoloniality proposes that colonialism performed much evil than class or hybridity, and termed the aftermath of colonialism as coloniality. Decoloniality also criticizes a present-day order where knowledge is still being dictated by the Euro-North Academy. Decoloniality as a perspective shows that the violence in exolonized world caused by colonialism still exists, and it poses three ways in which decoloniality can be understood. These three pillars of coloniality, namely coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of being, are not explained in postcolonialism. Next, I will be present by Yasmin.
Okay, how does the history of colonization pertain to the UK today? The British Empire at its peak included more than 25% of the world's landmass and a quarter of its population. During the first half of the 20th century, the empire was gradually and colony after colony assumed the status of an independent state. British sovereignty had in some of the colonies last for centuries and had in many ways defined country's culture and society. This was seen particularly in countries where the native population was subdued and had to adjust to British culture and lifestyle. For example, in New Zealand and Australia. The new liberty and independence were of course welcomed by the inhabitants of the colonies, but it proved to be a demanding task for the colonies to establish a culture and national identity of their own. The British had left behind a legacy which is still evident in many ways in the country. The first is language. Primarily due to British colonization, the English language has achieved a status as the world language number one. 4,000 billion, 4,000 million people, 4,000 million in nine countries have English as their mother tongue, while another 30 countries use English as an official second language. English has become a lingua franca all over the world. In fact, a basic knowledge of English is compulsory to get by in most fields of human activity today: traveling, business, aviation, diplomacy, education, technology, marketing, and so on. For cultural understanding and international communication, it is important that people can speak the same language. English colonization and American culture influence have provide a common world language. However, some smaller countries see this Anglo-American impact as a threat and have taken measures to protect their own language and national identity. And then the second is Education. Most of the people in the colonies were illiterate when the British took over. So the English took up the white man's burden to enlighten and teach the native population of this country. The English ruling class founded schools and educational system that would support their own status and sovereignty. Like in India, where a group of native Indians were educated as officials to serve the British Empire as intermediaries between the British and the Indians. In other former British colonies, like Australia and New Zealand, we see school system and educational principle that led by English standard. And then next is cultural and society. Cultural beverages, tradition, and custom are still maintained in many of the former colonies. Australia and New Zealand were mainly settled by British immigrants, and they brought with them their own customs and values. The flags of the two nations of the fact that they formally still have the English monarch as their foreign, as their sovereign. If you check the list of the some 70 countries in the world where they drive on the left, most of them are former British colonies. Among them, you will find countries like Australia, New Zealand, along with many countries in Caribbean. Most of the former colonies of the British Empire has joined the Commonwealth of Nations, which initially was called the British Commonwealth. It is a loose association of 54 independent states, former to encourage international understanding and cooperation in fields like culture, trade, and sport. And then, when the empire was dissolved, Britain opened its door for a massive immigration from the former colonies. They came for education and work, but also to meet a British need for a workforce to rebuild the country after the Second World War. Some of these immigrants returned to their home countries, but most of them stayed and become this and become the start of what we today see as multicultural Britain. Yeah, I think enough.
Okay, I think that's all we can say. Sorry for all the mistake. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.